I'm Ed Adams, and this is the Weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. I don't think I'm alone in this, but when I come across an ancestor who served in the military, I get a whole new level of excitement about researching that individual. Part of it is just the realization that their service opens up a whole new avenue of resources that I can learn about them. But for me, I think a big part of it is learning about their experience in the military. Sure, I think being in the military might influence my interest in these sorts of things, but as I consume genealogy-related content from around the internet, I notice a fairly common theme that military research is something that a lot of people find meaningful. Unfortunately, unlike some other areas of genealogy, military research, and I use air finger quotes there if you couldn't hear it in my voice, military research isn't as simple as census records or other vital records. What you can find and where you can find it will vary widely based on when your ancestor served. So I want to do a series of episodes on American military research. If you have ancestors who served in foreign militaries, I'd love to be able to help you, and yeah, I've done a little Austrian military research, but I don't think I'm really qualified to help you out in those areas. While there are, unfortunately, a large number of American conflicts to focus on, and while hands down the most popular research area is the American Civil War, I want to try and go chronologically and start with the American Revolution. Yes, there were American conflicts prior to this, but they were under the auspices of Great Britain. So for the purposes of the podcast, I'm going to call that foreign military research and out of my bailiwick. There are some significant challenges with conducting Revolutionary-era military research, and chief among those is that there is a strong desire among many American genealogists to have some sort of family link to that war. This leads to some questionable research and analysis and making leaps of faith. I have many ancestors who lived in the United States during this time period that lots of folks on the internet claim were soldiers or sailors during the war, but very few of them actually were. You'll often hear the claim that only about 3% of the colonial population served in the military or militia during the war, but that was bad scholarship followed by some worse motives. I've also seen counterclaims of 25 to 30% of the population, which would be a shockingly high value. This is also poor scholarship, which overestimates significantly by dubious definitions of service and failing to account for repeated enlistments and substitutes. The real number probably lies somewhere around 10%. Which is still a pretty significant amount of the population. But this should give you a sense as to how frequently you might come across a revolutionary veteran in your tree. Now, service propensity varied by region and ethnic group, so you might have a line that ran into a hotbed of revolutionary activity. But don't just assume that because your ancestor was male of the right age during that time that they must have served. Another interesting challenge associated with the Revolutionary War is that just because you can't find any records of your ancestor's service doesn't mean they didn't serve. There were plenty of American colonists who planted their flag on the British side and served in loyalist units. Don't make the assumption that because your ancestor was living in the same area after the war, that it means that they couldn't have been a loyalist. While many loyalists did flee to Canada or back to Great Britain, there are a large number that just integrated right back into their previous communities. So you're going to need to look in a few different places to figure out if your ancestor served. So once you've found your ancestor that you think may have served, where do you go? Well, this depends on your level of historical understanding. For many people, the best place to start is going to have nothing to do with your ancestor, at least directly. You need to gain some familiarity on the conflict and, more importantly, the structure and practices of the Army and/or the Navy at the time. You'll be unlikely to understand, or at least understand the significance, of any records that you might find if you don't understand the structure of the forces at play, and the areas involved, and the specific time periods of involvement by area. For a basic understanding of the conflict, I'd just recommend reading through a Wikipedia article or two and perhaps watching a documentary on YouTube. But keep in mind that the quality of both of those resources can vary considerably. I recommend them mainly because you can typically get reasonably reliable information from them on things like this, and they're pretty easy for most people to access and present information in a way that can be quickly digested. We aren't looking to create experts here, we just need to understand the context that your ancestor may have served in. For a better understanding of the Army, the only place I can really recommend that you go is the U.S. Army's Center of Military History, links in the description. There is more available on this site than you can possibly ever want to know about the Army. but the best resource for understanding the Continental Army is Robert K. Wright Jr.'s aptly titled The Continental Army. You can download a PDF for free. It's almost 500 pages, but don't get discouraged because it's well organized by time period and geography, so you really only need to read the bits that are of interest to you. But I'd suggest reading at least chapters 1 and 2, which will give you a great foundation. But what if your ancestor didn't serve in the regular army? Very few of mine did. Most were militiamen. That can present something of a challenge because militia units were under the governance of each respective colonial government. Still other militia units stood up after the commencement of the war and were cobbled together in various forms of organization into each colony's bureaucratic structure. While what constituted a continental unit was fairly well defined, there were further somewhat nuanced lines drawn between state or provincial troops, which were a sort of state-level regular unit, and militia units, which were your short term of service units that would often form and disappear a few times within a year. There are a few websites that focus on militia histories of certain colonies, so you can always just do some thorough Google searching and see what's out there. I'm much less solid on my Revolutionary Era naval research. I've done a little, but I'm not about to say I can send you to the best resources. I would definitely hit up the Naval History and Heritage Command website, and if your ancestor didn't serve in the Navy proper, you can check out Robert H. Patton's Patriot Pirates. It's a history of American privateering during the war. A really interesting read, and some good histories of ships that were never part of the Naval Registry, but fought on behalf of our fledgling nation anyway. But you don't come to me for book recommendations, I know. Once you've built up some contextual knowledge, it's time to go digging for sources on your ancestor. The first place that I like to look is on fold3.com. If you've started and stopped your genealogical journey a few times, you may remember a website called footnote.com. Fold3 is its new name, and it's now part of the Ancestry ecosystem of websites, along with newspapers.com, Find a Grave, and a few others. It's an online archive focused mostly on military records and other non-military records that might help you better understand your ancestors' military service. If you're curious about the name, it's in reference to the three-sided folded flag often presented to next of kin at military funerals, or as it's sometimes displayed in a military shadow box. I like starting here because they have 44 record collections that contain information about Revolutionary service members, and a few of them are pretty substantial in size. Their U.S. Revolutionary War pensions and service record collections together have almost 11 million records. Now keep in mind that a record is a single bit of data, not necessarily a document, but still, the pensions collection alone holds 80,000 pension and bounty land applications, each of which will reference several people, places, battles, and so on. Pensions are a funny thing to work with, though, because they came about slowly and developed over time. The first pension program actually started during the war, intended to help with service members injured as a result of their service, but this program continued to evolve, with the last amendment occurring in 1878, which covered widows of service members who served as few as 14 days. Because of this, your ancestor may not have been eligible for a pension during their lifetime. It wasn't really until 1832 that the vast majority of veterans became eligible for some kind of pension. Prior to that, most pensions were targeted at officers or enlisted men who had served lengthy terms. This meant that many militiamen, who often served 3 to 6 month terms, weren't ever eligible during their lifetimes. If you're lucky enough and either have an officer in your tree or an enlisted soldier who lived long enough to claim a pension, you're going to learn quite a bit about them. For example, one of my ancestors, Benjamin Brown of Elbert County, Georgia, filed for a pension in 1832 on account of his several terms of service in various militia units. There are some 36 pages in his file which contain, among them, his personal account of his service, where he talks about the units he served in, the officers he served under, and most importantly, the battles he participated in. For many people, that's about everything they can hope to learn about their ancestors' military service, and that was all on a single page. Sometimes you'll find the statements of witnesses who attest to the truthfulness of the applicant's claims. This is a nice way of fleshing out some of your ancestors' fan club, and can sometimes give you additional details, particularly if the witness served in the same units, and perhaps provided a more detailed description of their time in service. You should keep in mind that your ancestor may not have served in the same state that they resided in after the war. In the case of Benjamin, he lived in Georgia after the war, but he had been living in and served in North Carolina during the war. He still filed his application in Elbert County, Georgia, though, so look for these things in multiple locations if you're related to a mover. Service records are a lot of fun to look at. These are usually a collection of slips that contain information compiled from muster rolls, payrolls, inspection records, provisioning records, clothing returns, and just about any other unit record that is held by the National Archives. Some super dedicated people dug through all these files and created individual service records that you can peruse, and there's really nothing like it. I remember the first time I was looking through the records of one of my collateral relatives, Ambrose Jones. He served in one of the additional Continental regiments, recruited in 1777, and his company muster roll record for April of 1778 stated that he was sick in camp at Valley Forge, along with many of his fellow soldiers, unfortunately. These records will help you find some of the more granular detail that you might not think is available for a conflict that far in the past. You'll learn about when your ancestor was sick, whether they were wounded in battle, when they were placed on guard or detached duty, and in some cases when they were issued additional clothing items, although the poor Continentals didn't receive many of those. You can even see when your ancestors were granted leave to return home for a short period. This can help you build out a timeline of their service. Balance this timeline against unit histories and larger histories of the conflict, and you can build a pretty accurate story of your ancestors' service in the Revolution. Fold 3 isn't a free resource, unless you already have the Ancestry.com All Access membership. If you don't, it has a standalone cost of about $50 a year when on sale and $80 a year regularly. You can access most of these records for free, though, at the National Archives. NARA's resources are a little more challenging to navigate, but there's a lot of stuff there, so I'll link to their collection of Revolutionary War sources. Many of the big genealogy sites, Family Search included, will have at least indexes of pension applications, with some locations offering more than others. So if you don't want to fork over for the Fold 3 level subscription, and you can't figure out NARA's website, you can still just go to your genealogy site's card catalog and have a look for yourself. It's easiest if you use the filters to filter military records for the United States. Then you can narrow down the appropriate dates and start ticking off which resources you want to look in. While you're on your big genealogy site, have a look at bounty land records. Both the federal government and state governments gave veterans land in lieu of pensions early on. Harkening back to last week's episode, I'll provide a link in the description to a good map of military bounty lands. So if you find that your Revolutionary War ancestor moved to one of those areas depicted on the map after the war, there's a good chance that they did so as a result of having received bounty lands. As usual, the government doesn't do anything without a mountain of paperwork, and sites like Ancestry.com have that paperwork. You can oftentimes find great details about the land granted to your relative, complete with maps. There's a lot more to look into, though. This is where I've accomplished the vast majority of my research, but I do from time to time check out other sites like the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Sons of the American Revolution. Both have free online databases of patriots that you can search. Neither gives you a ton of information, but if you find someone that looks like your ancestor, you can purchase a prior application packet for that patriot, which can have a lot of useful information. Ancestry has SAR applications from 1889 through 1970, though, so there's a good chance that if you're already an Ancestry member, you can find the application that way. This isn't the end, though. Once I've learned a fair bit about my ancestor and their service, I like to correlate across other sources that may not necessarily be directly about my ancestor, but might provide me with more detail. One of my biggies is being able to track the battlefield activities of my ancestors. So, once I find service records that tell me what units they served in and what months they were reported as present for duty, I can go look at things like operational maps to see the routes they marched, and battle maps to see where on the battlefield they were. My family doesn't know it yet, but in a future family vacation, we will be visiting Kings Mountain so that I can walk the battlefield along the footsteps of the ancestor I previously mentioned, Benjamin. I'll be able to stand where he stood and look up the hill and imagine seeing Major Patrick Ferguson on his horse, just before being fatally struck. It was, after all, Benjamin's commander, who rode away at the end of the day on that very same horse. There are a lot of good places to look for operational and battle maps. When dealing with the Revolutionary War specifically, my two favorite places are the American Battlefield Trust and the United States Military Academy at West Point's Digital History Center. Again, links will be in the description. As we go along with the series, we'll try to look at each of our major conflicts and how to go about researching them. But you will see that basically it's variations on a theme. Some conflicts have more records available than others, but in general, you want to find the unit records, service member records, pension or land records, and then correlate all of that with other things like histories, maps, and more. I hope that you have found some of this useful. I really love researching this time period and the conflict in specific. Finding my first Revolutionary War veteran in my family lit a motivational flame for me that has yet to burn out. If you find something interesting about a Revolutionary War veteran in your family, I'd love to hear about it. Please reach out to me on Twitter @thewgtpod. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.